The quality of your life is determined by the quality of your questions. I love that quote from Tony Robbins. And today I'm going to give you my favorite growth question, which just been so effective at getting me unstuck and moving forward. And anyone can use this at any stage of life, whether you're a person of faith or not. And in fact, if you stick around, I've got this kind of fun chart where I look at the different questions we ask as the different stages of life. We go 20s, now 50s, and now 80s, etc. But yeah, here's the question I ask myself every day to keep growing. Let's dive into it. Hey, welcome to A Little Nudge. My name is Derek, and for the last 3 decades, I've been helping people explore and grow their faith. And in these videos, I'm just giving you a few nudges, a few tools to help you live a deeper and a more meaningful life. So I'm going to give you a simple, powerful question that you can use that's really going to unlock your own spiritual growth. But before I give you the question, I just want you to think about why questions are so powerful and to compare them with what we normally use, which is like statements or commands, advice, shoulds. That's what we normally do. But I want you just to think about questions and how different they feel. And statements like commands and shoulds tend to be stagnant and they tend to be a burden that weighs us down. Whereas when you ask a question, it seems to release the creative power of God and feel very different. Let me give you a couple of examples and just feel how these statements versus questions are in different circumstances. So let's think about anger. And someone's like, I need to stop being angry. It's a statement, stagnant, that kind of weighs them down. But if it was a question which was like, how can I move towards a place of less anger? Or I wonder what's triggering the anger in me? Or is there anything good about this anger? The questions can release stuff. Or what about, I need to pray more? Yes, I need to pray more. A statement, advice, command, it stagnant. There's no energy there. But what about, how could I pray more? What would it look like if I had more prayer in my life? Can you see how those questions are more creative? Or I should be more loving. I should be a more loving person. There's no dynamic there, is there? But what would it look like today if I was to ooze love wherever I went? You know, questions themselves that can be really powerful at energizing our God's presence in us. And we can use all sorts of questions, and Jesus did. But here's one question that I found most helpful. And I'm trying to think about this all the time, every day. And here it is. What's my growth question? That's it. What's my growth question? Thinking about my spiritual growth and my development and where I am at life in the moment. What is it I'm wrestling with? What is it that I need to give attention to? And framing it as a question rather than a failure or pressure can be much more powerful. It might be the growth question is, how can I forgive my mum? How can I use my time to impact the world? How can I stop money ruining my marriage? What is God saying to me? How can I stretch and challenge my kids in a way that they still feel loved? Could be anything else, but can you see that if you get kind of this question or thing at the moment that God's saying to you that you're wrestling with, it gives you a framework and it gives you an energy. I wonder what your growth question is at the moment. What is it you need to wrestle with or pay attention to? And the reason that the question is so powerful, I mean, it's got 2 underpinning principles that make it really, really effective. And the first is this, that growth starts where we are. Yeah, our development and our growth starts where we are. Too often, others' expectations or what we should do gets imposed on us. And yeah, in an ideal world, I should do that and I should do that. But actually, it starts where we are. Rather than comparing to others, we need to appreciate our context. And if you've had a horrific year full of loss and pain, then actually your growth question at the moment is about grief and processing that. And that gives you permission to kind of explore that. If you're a parent with 3 kids that are like under 5 and life's just relentless and so tired, then stuff about volunteering and giving your time away probably doesn't apply. It's your growth question at the moment. Maybe it's about anger or coping with rest or whatever it might be. And it helps release us from shame and guilt of not being like somebody else. And it helps us pay attention to right now, what God's doing and actually what's going on in our life. All truth is true, but not all truth is helpful or relevant for us. We need to pay particular attention. And Jesus did this all the time. When you see him speaking to people, actually, he gives them their growth questions. He gives them what they need in that moment, that context, rather than just giving everybody the same. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean. So there's a time when Jesus is speaking to this rich young ruler who comes to him and he wants to know how he could be good and successful. And Jesus talks to him, etc., and gives him lots of advice. But then ultimately, Jesus lands on this and he says to him, actually, ultimately, what you need to do is take all your money and give it away to the poor. Jesus identified that's your growth issue. Money has got a hold. But Jesus didn't walk around telling everybody they needed to give all their money away. In fact, another rich person he spoke to, Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector. So he was a Jew, but he was getting taxes for the invading army, the Romans. So he was like in Nazi Germany, be supporting the Nazis. If you were a Jew, you were supporting the enemy. And he got wind of Jesus coming, and he was a small guy, and he was fearful for his life, so he didn't want to go in crowds. So he climbed up at the tree to see Jesus, and Jesus spotted him. And Jesus knew that he had money, and he got that money from robbing the poor and being unfair in his dealings. But Jesus doesn't tell him to give his money away like he did with a rich young ruler. Jesus says to him, Zacchaeus, I want to come and eat with you. And in that culture, that was a sign of connection and intimacy and relationship and welcome. And so Jesus kind of welcomes him, the person who's rejected and excluded, and a sense of all the shame of the stuff he's doing. And as Jesus eats with him, Zacchaeus gets an overwhelming sense of grace in his life. And he says, you know what, I'm going to give half my money away to the poor. And the people that I've robbed, I'm going to give them 4 times back, even though Jesus never told him he needed to do that. Because what he needed was to feel belong and accepted. There was a woman who had been bleeding, who was really ill, bleeding for 12 years, and she sees Jesus in the crowd, and she doesn't want to get in his way, so she just reaches out for his hem and touches the very edge, and she thinks, if I just touch that, that'll be enough. And she touches the hem of his cloak, and she gets healed. And Jesus senses the power going out of him, and he turns around and said, who touched me? And the disciples are like, we're in the middle of a crowd. Everybody's touching you. Everybody's where. But he's like, no, someone's touched me. And the woman rather kind of ashamedly comes forward and said, it was me. And Jesus looks at her and says, daughter, your faith has made you well. He knew her growth question was about rejection and shame, and she didn't need to just get healed. She needed to be honored and elevated in that community, which is why he drew her. And you see Jesus treating people completely different because he knows what their growth question, he knows what their issue is. So partly when we're thinking, what is my growth question? We're thinking right now, what's God doing in my life? What is it I need to work on? What are the things I need to be doing? And that can change from decade to decade in our lives. And I've noticed that actually people have different questions compared to which stage of life they're at. And this is like really important that we don't compare ourselves to others, but we look at our context. And it might be helpful if I just kind of give you a flavor of the big questions we tend to ask at each decade in our lives. And maybe you can identify yourself. I'm going to show you how our questions change as we go through life. Just before I do that, if you could subscribe to the channel, if you could like this video and comment, that would just help me so much. But yeah, let's dive into the questions that we ask at different stages in our lives. And so we got questions we might ask as we are in our teens, in our 20s, in our 30s, and in our 40s. And I think that as a teen, our questions are all about our identity. We tend to ask, who am I? Who am I becoming? When we get onto our 20s, maybe we're starting to think about jobs and serious relationships. And so that's about direction, which is about who will I do life with? What will I do? And then maybe we get 30s, maybe we got married or had kids or we got mortgage or whatever it might be. And we start to think about questions related to order. So we're thinking, how do I deal with all my responsibilities? How do I manage my commitments? And then as we get to our 40s and we start to hit a bit of disillusionment, a bit of disappointment, we start to assess a little bit where we are in life. And we might ask questions like, how do I deal with disappointments? How do I deal with successes? And then we've got the latter half of life, maybe our 50s, our 60s, our 70s, our 80s. And then the questions start to change. And maybe as we hit our 50s, maybe our questions about redirection, maybe we start to ask what part of life needs rearrangement. There's going to be a second part of my life. What sort of things need to change? And this is where the midlife crisis happens, and we start to think more about legacy and that sort of stuff. And then as they get into our 60s, that really comes into focus. We start to think, as my life grows quieter, what's my legacy going to be? Maybe we get a second vision. What's my place in this world, as they start to see me as weak or obsolete? And we start to really want to make an impact as the end of our life gets a bit more strongly on the horizon. And I know I've spoken to people in their 70s, then loss becomes an increasingly big part of their life. Maybe their 20s, they were going to a funeral every other weekend. When they get the 70s, people seem to be going to a funeral every other month. And then the question is like, how do I deal with an increasing sense of loss, which might be about mobility, it might be disability, it's their health. And then the last one, if people as get to their 80s and their 90s, actually, they're just like, how am I going to deal with death? What sort of death am I going to have? How am I going to face that? And so sometimes it can be helpful to see, I mean, it's not a perfect model, but it can be helpful to see how our questions shift and our lives shift. And certainly I've seen that in my life. And maybe you can use that to identify what your growth question is. And so the first power of this growth question is it starts where we are. But the second reason that it's so effective and powerful is because God does one thing at a time in our lives. Now, I haven't got like a Bible verse to prove this, but just looking at my own life and the people I've worked with and supported and coaches, and what I've noticed is God works on one thing at a time with us. He's very kind and graceful. There is a time where Jesus says his burden and his teaching is light. He talks about a yoke oxen had on them to steer them. And he said, actually, when you put my guidance on you, my teaching, it's light burden. It doesn't overwhelm you. And what I've noticed is people are very sensitive to guilt. So if I'm talking about anything, I find people have got really strong guilt triggers. So if I'm talking about prayer, people are like, oh yeah, I need to pray more. If I'm talking about anger and losing our temper, oh yeah, I should be more patient. If I talk about money, people say, oh yeah, I really should give more money away. Or I talk about phones and we're like, oh yeah, I should use my phone less and be less addicted. Or we're talking about the poor people in our society and community, folks. Oh yeah, I should probably volunteer to help homeless people or something. And it's like this instinct of all these shoulds that we do. But like, should we really? I mean, should we really just be saying yes to all these things, all these commands? Does God really just come with us a massive list and say, you need to pray more and you give more, and you need to do this and you need to do that and you need to do that? And he just dumps it all on us. And my experience is that comes from a dark place. And actually what God does is he looks at us and he's like, you know what, Derek, I think we're just going to work on your anger at the moment. Or God says, you know what, actually, money's getting a bit of hold of your life. We're just going to work on that for a season. And I think God gently comes to us. And by asking the growth question, what's my growth question at the moment? What's my focus? What's the thing I'm wrestling with? It's almost like an invitation to listen to God, to say, actually, where God at work in his life? Of where's God at work in my life? What's the next thing on his agenda? And that actually means something really positive. So rather than a burden and a list of shoulds, if God is triggering a growth question in our mind, then actually that means he's ready to do something in our life, that we're not alone with a list of commands, but actually God's presence in our life, that if he triggers something we need to think about as a growth question, then it means his spirit is going to help us to do something about it. And rather than a to-do list that just like, oh, it just wrecks us and wears us out and exhausts us, it's more exciting and energizing. And so I wonder what your growth question is, and to just think about that and just mull that over. Maybe when you're in your quiet time or when you're walking or you're just pondering, why don't you say, what's my growth question? What exactly is it? And just sit with it and let that spiritual energy rise up and go with it and see where you leads. And sometimes you'll have a question that'll stay with you weeks. Other times it'll be months that you'll be carrying this same thing as God does a deeper and a deeper work in your life. And if you sometimes struggle with the idea of comparison and you're always looking at other people, I found the idea of seasons really helpful, of clarifying what season I'm in and what that means for me. And this video here, I just walk through how that can really make life lighter and give us clarity about the direction that we're in. And so I just recommend that you look at that video next. Anyway, thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next video.